Today's Jim Crow is just one of the many results of America's biggest failure. Now ask yourself what that could be. It is our nation's biggest problem. It is robbing the American citizen of their tax dollar. The effects? A lack of respect for law enforcement figures and the law itself. It targets African Americans through racism, and today it has laid a format for modern-day slavery. What's responsible for all these terrible things? It's not a drug. It's called the war on drugs.
Drug war was built off of fear, propaganda.
The war on drugs, in my opinion, was started basically because of racism.
It was built off of, it was ramped up by Richard Nixon, who was known as Tricky Dick Nixon. And it was a very shrewd and cunning and clever propaganda campaign, which he used to marginalize people in the anti-war movement and the hippies, and to rally the law and order crowd against drugs, which were not anywhere near the problem that his propaganda campaign stated they were.
A major part of the drug war was the use of propaganda. Such films as Reefer Madness brainwashed the public with unreliable information on drug use. Such stories like marijuana makes white girls want to sleep with black men. Drugs were always linked with minority groups, and propaganda made white people the victims. Mexicans and African Americans were often attacked with the theories of drug use.
They talked about crack babies. Babies being born from mothers who had used crack, who were addicted when they came out of the womb. And they said these babies will be ruined for life. Their minds will be ruined. They will grow up to have no hope for the future. And this was in every newspaper, on the television, just demonizing the women who used these drugs.
They were also concerned about the inner cities because there were riots during that period of time, and they believed that either there was having to do with the drugs.
In 1969, President Nixon made it clear to all Americans that marijuana was public enemy number one. The war on drugs had begun. It is unclear what Nixon sought out to do. What were the goals that Nixon had set out when declaring his war on drugs?
Well, the goal of the drug war was to eliminate the consumption, the purchase, and the sale of drugs. Plain and simple. That's the goal of the drug war.
There are 7 things that will happen if we fight this drug war. The first is that the supply of drugs to the United States will decline. And when that happens, then the purity of the street level drugs, the hard drugs, will also decline.
In 2010, 40 years later, after arresting 30 million people, after increasing the prison population from 38,000 to 500,000.
Prices go up, and then they say the next 4 factors will fall in automatically, and those 4 things are that we will have less people using drugs, we will have less drug overdoses, we will have less drug prohibition murders, and lastly, we will have less people being arrested for drug violations.
It hasn't succeeded on any one of those issues. Drugs, at the time of the declaration of the war on drugs in 1970, there were 38,000 people in prison in this country on drug charges. The availability of drugs is greater than it ever was before. The price of drugs like cocaine and heroin are cheaper than they ever were before, and the strength of the products is they're much stronger.
When we started the war on drugs, we really didn't have much of a problem with drugs in the United States. As a matter of fact, if you go back and you look at the statistics from that year, you'll see that the likelihood of anybody dying as a result of the drug culture was less than the likelihood of them dying from falling down the steps in their own house. was less than the likelihood of them dying from choking to death on their own food at dinner. But we started a war on drugs.
536,100 American soldiers were deployed to the jungle terrain of Vietnam, where the war would be a living nightmare that they would have to serve, witnessing horrific events. Each individual dealt with these shortcomings in their own way.
Nixon used the anti-war movement as sort of his motion to institute this propaganda campaign against illegal drugs. That's one way that the Vietnam War played into it. The anti-war movement was associated with using products like cannabis.
During the Vietnam War, our soldiers, the American soldiers there, started using quite a bit of drugs, and they were using a lot of marijuana, cannabis.
Vietnam soldiers found an escape from the horrors of war. Smoking marijuana, they found it peaceful, which was something to be savored out there in Vietnam. When President Nixon first heard that the majority of the American soldiers were smoking cannabis, he feared that the effects of smoking the drug would make them pacifist, taking away their motivation to fight.
Talk about Vietnam in the parameters of the marijuana use and also more stringent or harder drug use, heroin and basically heroin.
And Nixon targeted him for that reason. The second thing is that certainly the soldiers in Vietnam were exposed to a lot of high quality controlled substances, or what are in this country illegal substances, like very powerful grades of cannabis as well as opium, heroin, and that type of thing.
Guys in Vietnam would smoke marijuana because of the dangers, and that relaxed them.
And Richard Nixon heard about that, and he was worried that this would somehow make his war sound bad. So he sent one of his people over there, a guy named Eagle Crow, to make sure that this was true, that what he had heard. And Eagle Crow came back and said, "Oh, it's even worse than we thought."
In fact, I know of a friend of mine who was a paratrooper in Vietnam, and he jumped out of an airplane in Vietnam, tripping on LSD, and so this is what they would do because it was a very dangerous situation.
But the soldiers didn't quit using drugs, they just cut down on the cannabis.
Yeah.
What they did instead was they switched over to number 4 grade heroin, which was the most pure heroin in the world, and it was even cheaper than the cannabis then. Where they were fighting, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. That was the Golden Triangle. And there's a huge percentage of soldiers from the Vietnam War that used heroin almost every day. And when you wonder why would they do such a thing, you got to think of how terrible that war was. Here we were putting young folks, 17, 18, 19 years old, in a situation that was unbearable. Not only did they see their friends around them being killed, but they were put in a position where they had to literally go out and slaughter men, women, children. We lost 68,000 of our troops during that war, and they estimate now that there were 2 to 3 million Vietnamese that were killed in that war. So it was literally a slaughter. And people can't live with that sort of thing. So they said, all right, I'll fight your damn war, but tonight I'm getting high. This seems to be the problem with the war on drugs. You have a problem, and then you go and try to do something about it, and instead of lowering it, you actually escalate it. Like he escalated it by now these soldiers aren't using cannabis, they're using heroin.
Its repeal, and it affects law enforcement dramatically because it diverts resources from important criminal investigations, and it creates all kinds of danger in the law enforcement community. as well as it fosters incredible corruption in the law enforcement community. And given the fact that it doesn't work and it's a complete failure.
When I was a young trooper, 1970, at the beginning of this war, kicking down doors and seizing hard drugs, our largest individual seizures were measured in pounds. Today, they're measured in tons. 20 tons of cocaine, one seizure. 15 tons of methamphetamine, one seizure. 23 tons of heroin, happened just March 23rd of 2013, one seizure. And believe it or not, 242 tons of marijuana, one seizure.
What Vietnam did at home was cause a great deal of concern. America was split. There were those people who were for the Vietnam War, and they were cast as hippies, as drug users, as young people, as, you have to be scared of them.
That really wasn't the story. The real story was how many people who had used heroin every day while they were in Vietnam had come home and just quit using anything at all. And of course the reason for that was once they were home, they didn't need a drug anymore. They were back in what they referred to as the world. They could get by without these drugs. So that's not what the drug warriors want you to think. They want you to think that anybody who tries a drug is going to become addicted. You certainly don't want to be part of that 10%. So nobody at LEAP wants to see anybody trying or using any kind of illicit drug or any drug at all.
How do people become addicted? There's many ways. One is that a person has a very low self-esteem. And they decide to take drugs in order to pass the time because they don't want to deal with how bad they feel about themselves. That's psychological. The other thing is that people want a constant feeling that, let's say, heroin gives me the same feeling every time I take it. But dealing with people, it's very scary. You don't know how to interact with people. So you fall in love with heroin, but you can't fall in love with a person because it's an unknown quantity when you fall in love with a person. But heroin is the same feeling all the way through. And the third one is trauma. When a person is traumatized when they're young, and or even at any age, when I would say that people most probably in high school or in teens start experimenting with alcohol and with drugs and things of that nature, and that's your developmental aspects. You've already been traumatized prior to that point, and if it hurts so much, and the trauma is alleviated by smoking marijuana or by doing any other things, any other types of drugs, then that's why they do it. And it's also peer pressure is one aspect too. There's a book out called The New American Jim Crow, in which it also talks about the basic racial undertones of the drug war. The majority of people who are in jail now are felons, and now when you become a felon, you're not allowed to vote in many states, are minorities.
When this supposed crack epidemic started, they thought there were more black folks than white folks using the crack. Certainly more black folks were being arrested for it.
They made a concerted effort saying that, we're going to bring a drug war, but it was a veiled racial tone to the white population to say, hey, listen, this is getting out of hand. We don't want the minorities to take control. So we're going to put them, we're going to make sure that they have the drugs. We're going to throw them in jail and make them become felons. And everybody makes money on that. And
it hurts, obviously, the people that are arrested, who, in many instances, there isn't really any strong consensus that these people are evil people, but they end up being saddled with criminal records, end up incarcerated, end up having their entire life affected by an arrest or a prosecution for something that there is no consensus as to exactly what it is that's bad about the conduct.
So when I started undercover in 1970, the beginning of that war, the main people that I was arresting were young people in college or high school or in between who were using marijuana, hashish, some LSD, psilocybin, the mind-bending drugs. The hard drugs like heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine were virtually unheard of back then. So what has happened is we have created a system where hard drugs are more expansive in use in the United States.
Again, I'll go back to the fact that use of these products is admitted to by 100 million people. So it's pure luck as to whether or not you end up getting into the criminal justice system or as a result of it. Although it isn't really luck in the sense that the prosecutions are targeted against specific classes of people, poor people, and people of color. So you're so much more likely to come under the boot of the criminal justice system for this type of conduct if you're a powerless person. Then the whole society suffers because of the corrosive effect on respect for the rule of law.
And the last point is they tell us that there will be finally less people that will be arrested every year. Well, before we started the war on drugs, for the 5 years before, the average amount of people arrested in the United States each year for nonviolent drug offenses was a little over 65,000 in the entire United States. Then we started this war on drugs, and it became a numbers game where it was arrest everybody that you could, anybody in sight practically. And by the year 2005, we had increased that 65,000 up to 1.9 million arrests per year of nonviolent drug offenders. Well, that's a lot of people, 1.9 million, right? Over the 42 years that we've been doing this, we've spent 1.5 trillion of your tax dollars and my tax dollars to fight this war on drugs. 1.5.
The industry that does benefit is the prison industry. And that's been in some places privatized, which is really an outrageous and scary development. But there are now private companies that are profiting from this mass incarceration that's resulted almost completely as a result of drug prohibition. And that's a horrendous, horrible policy byproduct of drug prohibition.
So it's more when you had talked about the big business. It isn't big business. It's the private business of let's say corrections and law enforcement that are making so much money on this.
But as far as the war of drugs go, it's definitely a huge waste in certain areas to the extent that they do it. They'll go into other countries and just be like, all right, we're going to fuck your shit up real quick. And we're going to shut down your drug lord shit. Instead of doing that, maybe we should be building alliances in those countries, helping them build those the same enforcement agencies in that countries, focus on our own country.
Back when Ronald Reagan was president, Nancy Reagan came up with the slogan, just say no. What Ronald Reagan actually attempted to do was to educate people on drugs. And if we did that as opposed to arresting people on drugs, it showed that during his 8 years as president, the use of drugs declined. So if we placed all of that money of enforcement into education, in other words, drug education, then I think that's the right way to do it, and that's the way we should approach it. I am really in favor of doing what they do in Portugal and what they've been doing in, I think it's Switzerland, I'm not sure, but making all of the drugs legal, but because it's a medical problem, it's not a legal problem.
Like if you make everything not a taboo, people aren't going to abuse it, and you're not going to see it everywhere because people aren't going to need to be sneaking around, lying, and hiding it.
Yeah.
People aren't going to need to drive around in their car to do it if they know they can sit on their front porch and do it. They'll be in their house if they don't think that cops are going to bust in if they see that drug deal going on.
Yeah.
Keep things off the streets.
Especially when you get into heroin and cocaine and things of that nature. Have methadone clinics available so people can come in and be protective, pay their taxes. Right now we have people who have heroin problems that aren't paying taxes, are taking up all of our support, all of our programs and everything, and they're not being productive. In other countries, they've solved it in a different way.
And then the other side of the argument is that everything's going to be fine when you don't make it a taboo. Actually, I think I'm sorry. Yeah, if you don't make it a taboo, people won't abuse it. But if you do, someone's like, it's going to be abused like crazy, and you're going to have car accidents and crazy people hallucinating and murdering people. And that's unavoidable, You have that nowadays with the drug illegal. The people that are going to take the drug and go crazy are the people that are doing it now. Because the ones that aren't going crazy and are taking it, they're taking it now and not going crazy. If we made heroin legal right now, I wouldn't go out and do some heroin. Are you going to do heroin?
No.
Right. If you take, meth and crack, unless you're ready to do that drug, you're not going to go out and want to do it now just because it's legal. Because if you're doing other illegal drugs, you're doing your illegal drugs for your own purpose. So I'm on the side with they should pretty much legalize all drugs across the board, and then take the war on drugs and turn that into a higher police enforcement monitoring system. Monitor the use, tax the shit out of stuff. Make stuff cleaner. You have so many deaths from drug mix-ups and bad drug doses and stuff and overdoses. If you want to sell drugs in stores, obviously you're gonna have people that steal it, and you're gonna have stockpiling of people so they can sell them mass amounts. Because I do think having a restriction. One idea is I think your license is scannable. I think if you're gonna buy a drug, you're only allowed to buy so much every so often based on the drug, right?
Yeah.
Weed in Massachusetts, you're allowed to have up to a 60-day supply. I think that's up to 6 ounces based on some illnesses. 6 ounces for 2 months is a ridiculous amount for some people. Some people can't smoke 6 ounces in a year. Because I know people that smoke an eighth a month. They smoke once every couple of days. So if you have it, how often you're allowed to get it for whatever drug, and you take the war on drugs money, you take that, those task force, and you apply them to, guards and proper security for the storage and distribution centers, I think that's fine. So then only the people that were going to abuse it anyways are going to abuse it. They're going to find the people that are stockpiling it, not using it, and selling. They're like, I buy it so I can sell it. You're going to have that.
The whole purpose of the drug war is to try to get our children away from using, selling, possessing these drugs. DEA tells us that in the United States we have at least 900,000 teenagers who sell illicit drugs. And DEA also tells us we have 900,000 teenagers who carry illegal guns. But apparently that's not enough to get the United States government to legalize these drugs. See, what happens when you legalize the drugs is you take them out of the hands of the criminals. You take them out of the hands of these teenagers selling these drugs, and you put them in the hands of supposedly responsible adults who we can control to some degree. Our kids, for the last 30 years, our kids in high school have told us it's easier to buy illegal drugs than it is to buy beer and cigarettes. And of course the reason for that is because if they go to buy these legal commodities, somebody at the locations where we regulate the sale of those commodities says, hey, are you old enough to buy this dope? Well, let me see an ID. Now you know that the drug dealer on the street corner or the other teenager in the same school classroom, in the next row, is not going to ask them for their age before they sell them these illicit drugs. We don't have whiskey and cigarettes being sold in schools, but we have any illicit drug you want to name. sold in our schools all across this country. We can't even keep drugs out of maximum security prisons. There's not one in the entire United States that doesn't have a drug problem. And if you can't keep it out of a maximum security prison, how can you ever expect to keep it out of the school? It's impossible. So the thing to do isn't try to prohibit these. It's to try to come up with a system that reduces the harm. We will never get rid of all drugs. That's impossible. Drugs have been around since the beginning of time. They've been used by humans since the beginning of time. That is not going to change. What can be changed, though, is the harms that we do as a result of that. Instead of prohibiting it, arresting everybody, imprisoning them, destroying their lives, why don't we treat this as a health problem? Why don't we say that people who are abusing drugs have a health problem and we want to help them? When we look,
America likes to use the word war, okay? War on terror, war on drugs. It's not a war, okay? I mean, we have this idea, it's a social problem. How do you solve a social problem? You solve it through many different ways. It's not just through guns, or it's not through just enforcement.
February 2012, I was invited by a group called Mexico Unida contra de Delincuencia, which means Mexico United Against the Drug War. I was invited to go to Mexico City and speak down there at a conference, and they really appreciated my coming down there. One of the really well-known artists from Mexico gave me this painting, which is his depiction of what's going on with the violence in Mexico. The reason they asked me to go down there is that in the last 6 years they've lost more than 65,000 people to drug prohibition murders, been killed by the drug cartels, other people murdered by the army, murdered by police who were on the side of the drug dealers. And there's another 25,000 people who are missing down there, who are suspected of having been murdered, of course. This is a terrible, terrible violence. And it's so much worse than it is in the United States. In the United States, we experience about 5 murders per 100,000 population. Down in Mexico, because of this drug war, they're experiencing more than 17 murders per 100,000. And actually, Mexico won't even compare with a lot of other countries that are even worse. In El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, it's far, far worse. In Guatemala, they have 42 drug prohibition murders per 100,000, and in Honduras, it's up to 92 drug prohibition murders per 100,000 population. Something that the United Nations has labeled Honduras the most dangerous country in the world.
Okay, why do you think people smoke pot? Well, I guess I can really just go off myself. It has different effects on everybody. But for me, what it does is, I guess part of it gets me to relax a little bit. But
when I smoke, I'm usually a lot more calm and relaxed.
I like to smoke pot for a lot of reasons. I think it's generally relaxing.
But something that it does for me, depending upon which it makes me feel, is it really stimulates a creative thought process.
We live in a time today that the drug culture has developed a new face. Legalization has become more of a possibility in the last decade. The number one drug that is the spotlight of the topic is cannabis. The drug had been labeled as one that steals ambition, is addictive, a gateway drug, and a long time ago they even went as far to say that it made you excessively violent. So many tall tales, such little facts, such little research.
Well, there are old stories. One of them is that Thomas Jefferson wanted to have a because hemp used to be made of rope, and Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers, wanted to have a market on hemp, so he decided to make everything illegal so that he could make his rope that way. But then in 1968, Richard Nixon came along because of the drug war, because of the youth revolting against the government. They started making all kinds of things illegal, anything from, that's when the DEA was created. So I would say it's more economic than anything else. Somebody wanted to corner the market on it.
Our director has been allowed to get seen by a medical marijuana doctor to hopefully get a license today here at the Holistic Clinic, which is run by lawyer Richard Comenzo, located in Brighton, Massachusetts.
What we do at the Holistic Clinic is we give consultations and evaluations to patients who are seeking medical marijuana certification. So if a patient is qualified, then they can receive a certification from us.
In Massachusetts, there are 9 basic diseases that automatically qualify medical marijuana. Cancer, glaucoma, HIV, AIDS, Crohn's, ALS, I think, and there are 2 or 3 more which I always forget. And any other condition that a doctor feels medical marijuana would benefit. So it's left open to the doctor.
Today, medical marijuana has been the stepping stone leading to legalization. Today, the research is finally being put into finding medical benefits in marijuana, and the research is proven to be more than expected. At the same time, patients must remember that medical marijuana is only legal by state laws. Medical marijuana is not legal under federal law.
Possess marijuana. It's illegal to grow marijuana. It's illegal to cultivate marijuana. And according to the federal standards, there's no medicinal value in marijuana, period. So it is a class 1 substance. You can get arrested, you can go to jail.
Law is totally irrational. Was when it was enacted and is today. And there's no rational explanation for that.
In Massachusetts and most states, to be eligible, you need medical records saying that you used medication previously for your condition that failed to treat your condition.
Mind me asking why you decided to enter the field of medical marijuana?
You know, I have always believed that people who have pain, that people who have suffering, that the last thing in life that they should be told what to do is not to use a natural herb. You know, I mean, it's always struck me as completely ridiculous that, you know, somebody who suffers from chronic pain, who has multiple sclerosis, who has HIV, who has AIDS, who has hepatitis C, that person is being told that they can't use something that makes them feel better, that grows naturally, when you can go out on the street, you can buy cocaine, you can buy heroin, but you can't use something that's natural that actually makes you feel better. I just think it's ridiculous.
The reason I started for the medical marijuana is very straightforward. I had a couple of doctors, and I've always believed that there was some benefit to medical marijuana. And they refused to give me, starting January when it was legal, they refused to give me anything because their idea was there's not enough science based upon on it to give me that kind of treatment. And so therefore I started my own clinic.
What are your beliefs of medical marijuana?
It's very interesting. The more and more patients that come in here and the more I delve into medical marijuana, situations have come. There's what has been determined to be an endocannabinoid system, just like the endocrine system, that has something to do with pain or shielding humans from pain. THC, CBDs enhance that, and we have our own natural THC and CBD within our own body. So that's why smoking marijuana decreases the pain in, let's say, chemotherapy and pain that you get from Lyme disease and things of that nature.
That it should always be kept a really big distinction, though, between recreational use and medical marijuana. and that distinction should always be made so that people don't confuse people with legitimate medical needs wanting to use marijuana recreationally. Yeah.
I smoke for a lot of reasons. Like sometimes I smoke just to hang out with my friends and just make it a little more, like, I mean, it's obviously fun, but just make things a little more interesting.
Yeah, let's get off the serious note. Why I like pot. Couple of reasons. It helps me fall asleep. I have a couple of ways that say it keeps them up. I find that smoking bud puts me out almost immediately. At the end of the night, after like a 10-hour day of work, it makes me hungry. Normally, if I'm sober, I can barely eat to sustain myself. I'll eat like once, maybe twice a day, but when I'm high, I can eat anybody out of house and home.
I smoke before, like, I play drums or before I write, because it gives me more inspiration to create. I feel like when I'm sober, there's a building, like there's a block between me and like that outlet of creativity. I feel like I just can't stimulate my mind enough to just get into it as much as I would like to.
Because when I smoke, I like to, I kind of branch off, and I just, I get really creative ideas for, business or for really anything. But I guess nowadays what I can really relate to is, growth of business, and it inspires and like really just sparks something in me which lasts even past, any high or buzz or whatever you want to call it. It's, you have to, or...
Basically, I believe 60% of the people voted here in Massachusetts for medical marijuana, so I would say that most people believe that marijuana is not a harmful drug.
How does it differ from like 50 years ago?
Well, if you take a look at 50 years ago, there was a film called Reefer Madness that specifically stated that if you smoke marijuana, you become sexually promiscuous, that you would go crazy, and so the government wanted to make sure that they would ban that type. So there's a real difference between then and now.
And kids who hear that, and then in the same breath hear that the last 3 presidents consumed the products, their respect for law is severely undermined. So a Schedule I drug, and Barack Obama, George W. Bush, and Bill Clinton all consumed it. That makes no sense at all. So what does it do? What is the effect of that? Is that children, when they hear that, see the lie of that also causes them to question and challenge whether they're getting true information about other controlled substances, other dangerous plants, like heroin and cocaine, which are definitely way more dangerous than cannabis is. But because we irrationally schedule cannabis as Schedule I, children and young adults logically question whether there's any truth to any information being put out by the government about these other products, which are potentially a lot more addictive and a lot more dangerous.
Do I believe alcohol to be a more dangerous substance than marijuana? Alcohol destroys more lives on this planet than any other substance. Alcoholism is a horrible disease. Drunk driving deaths, domestic abuse, these are all results of alcohol. Alcohol tears apart families, it tears apart communities. It's especially affected indigenous people throughout the world, including Native Americans here in America. And marijuana, on the other hand, has never been proven to cause a death. It's never broken apart a family, except for perhaps moral differences within a family. And the differences are like night and day. One destroys the body, and the other has been medically proven to heal the body. As far as I know, alcohol isn't used clinically anymore. You know, in the 1800s it was used by quacks to say that it healed everything, but I don't know any doctors that prescribe alcohol. And yet, now in America, you know, we have legalization of medical marijuana popping up throughout the country for one reason, because it's been proven to have medical benefits.
It's not true. Does not kill brain cells. Sorry. Otherwise, I think, if it did, then I'm sure Bill Clinton and President Obama might not have too many brain cells left.
I don't think marijuana is addictive at all.
Not even meant.
It's the personality that is addictive. The person has an addictive personality. Whatever drug you give that person, they will either go further to find a greater high, or they will just stay with marijuana, and they will become addicted to that.
Like, if I smoke before I write, I'll just be so much more open to ideas and different, like, possible twists in the story. So
Your issue is with migraines, huh?
Yes.
And how long have you had migraines?
Started when I was about maybe 9, 10.
When I was 14. Look at my finger. Double vision from that, or?
There's certainly the big pharma, the pharmacological industry is profiting tremendously from the drug war. Just think about medical marijuana, for instance. Medical marijuana can replace maybe a couple hundred drugs that are made by these pharmacological companies that they are selling for huge prices. And if medical marijuana is legal throughout the country, they won't be able to get their profits from those drugs.
to me, it's to have fun and it's to create, and it's also because, like, I have clinical depression. I don't believe in depression medication. So when I smoke, it makes me less sad. It puts me in a better mental state. And I like that because it's completely natural. It's not harmful to me, and I don't risk the addiction to prescription medication. So I just think it's a better alternative.
Its procedure is to get a basic physical by the holistic doctor and see if you're eligible to retrieve a medical marijuana card for your condition.
We had one of LEAP's directors, a wonderful woman. She was a judge in Florida. Her name was Eleanor Shockett. And the way she joined us was, she heard about LEAP one day and she resigned her position as a judge the next day after she heard about us. She said to me when she joined LEAP that she wanted her rights again to be able to speak about the terrible things that's going on in the drug war, and she couldn't do that as a judge. So she resigned and joined us. But she got cancer. She died some years ago. But when she had that cancer, she lived in South Carolina. And South Carolina didn't have medical marijuana. So she was getting nauseous from taking these very potent drugs of these pharmacological companies. And she was asking her doctor, why can't I have medical marijuana? Because I know that this will take the nausea away and I'll be able to survive better. She just couldn't understand why this was going on. And her doctor said, oh, that's okay. You know, we have other drugs that will do the same thing as medical marijuana. And she told me, sure enough, they gave her a pill that also took the nausea away. The only problem was the pill cost $205 per pill. So there is a lot of money that these pharmacological corporations are making.
When entering the medical marijuana field, you have to consider problem areas that are most confronted when entering the medical marijuana business.
The problem areas are things of someone who has a mental health problem. They want to take medical marijuana. Does that enhance or decrease their ability to cope with their medical marijuana? A person who has a drug problem, does that help or decrease if he has a medical marijuana card or medical marijuana in his system? So there are some gray areas also.
With medical marijuana growing in state after state, What could this all mean for the major pharmaceutical companies?
Medical benefits are anything ranging from relief of anxiety to relief of pain. It helps a lot with the pain. It helps a lot with people being anxious. For example, a person who doesn't want to go outside and feels uncomfortable with people, it relaxes them and makes them less anxious.
Right. But I mean, that's why I smoke it, because that's what it, or at least that's what I feel it does to me. It could be completely in my head, but from talking with other people, it does different things to everybody. No one experiences the same thing, and it's just it's a very kind of like a meditation.
What do you see as the steps of full legalization?
Well, once they find out that their entire model for medical, well, let's take a look at Colorado. Colorado has medical marijuana and it has recreational marijuana. They have both types. They have a store for medical marijuana and there's a store right next to it for recreational marijuana. The difference is that the medical marijuana's quality is much more stringent than the recreational one. So the steps are, first of all, in the next couple of years, to show that medical marijuana, that people aren't driving and crashing because they're on OUI marijuana, and it shows that there's a benefit to it. And once they show it's a benefit to it, it becomes a Schedule III drug. Once it becomes a Schedule III drug, it's legal.
Now,
you want me to stand on a box that make me look taller?
what would you, because when we were together, you said that there were some things, what would you like to add on or say about medical marijuana that you think people should know about?
Well, the fallacies that are currently out there concerning the skepticism that everybody's in the industry for the money. There are people in there that are only there for the money. There's no question about that. People have huge amounts of money. Just in Massachusetts alone, you have to put up $500,000 just to start a dispensary, and it has to be cold cash. And that takes a lot, okay? And it has to be a non-profit, which I don't necessarily agree with. There's a form called a benefit corporation, which is a for-profit corporation, which I believe we should be using, and not the non-profit model. But the DPH has said the non-profit. And the second fallacy is that only stoners want to get this medicine. They just want to be stoned all day, and it's going to destroy the fabric of America. There are a lot of people out there who have a lot of problems, a lot of conditions that can be helped. And once we open this up and allow people to obtain the medical marijuana, and then I think people's minds will change.
People together, I think that's one of my favorite things. Two people that have nothing in common but smoke weed can sit together, smoke weed, and then have a quote-unquote euphoric moment together. And then after that moment ends, they're going to part ways. But it brings people together. And why do some people like using like icy hot like patches on their back? To relax them. Other people play golf.
Well, if I'm getting on an elevator and people see this button, they say, "Why?" If I can ride 8 floors with those people, I can usually convince them in that short amount of time that we should legalize the drugs. How do I do it? Well, I say, we fought the war on drugs now for 43 years. We've spent $1 trillion of your tax dollars and my tax dollars on that war, and all we have to show for it is that we've made more than 46 million arrests of non-violent drug offenders over that time. We do whatever we can do to destroy their lives. So we at LEAP believe that if we legalize and regulate these drugs, we can end the violence by taking it away from the criminals. We can reduce death, disease, crime, and addiction by legalizing and regulating these drugs. And I usually say, that makes sense.